Well, true to the last few budgets, some of the biggest measures were leaked in a few days leading up to the budget. So we had a reasonably good idea that there'll be a 2% cut to something, probably national insurance, and that's what happened. Some debate as to whether it would happen because it is a very, very expensive thing to do to start cutting national insurance. So the 2% cut is actually going to, 2% cut to employees' national insurance and the cut to self-employed national insurance is going to cost about £10 billion a year. So in budgetary measures, that's a big step. The employees' national insurance is going down from 10% to 8%. Not very long ago, as early as December 2023, that rate was 12%. So we've had a cut from 12 to 8% in not very much time at all. And the self-employed national insurance, which was already due to go from 9 to 8% in April 2024, is now going from 9 to 6%. So big savings in terms of what we've seen in budgetary measures recently. For somebody on, say, a £35,000 salary, they're going to be £37 per month better off. At the top end, where somebody's paying the full national insurance at the middle bandings, they're going to be £62 a month better off. I would say the Chancellor's probably missed a trick. He could have played around with the thresholds to try and focus the savings on lower earners, but he's left the savings available to everybody. So even if you're earning £10 million a year, you're still going to be £62 a month better off. This is a national insurance saving, not an income tax saving. So if you're a buy-to-let landlord, if you're a saver, say a pensioner, you're not going to enjoy any of these benefits. This is only for people in employment or self-employment. Although these savings are good news for people, they don't really reverse the effects of fiscal drag. And if the rates and allowances had gone up in line with inflation over the last few years, the savings would actually be far greater. So what looked to be the clear differentiator between the Labour Party and the Conservative Party's tax announcements were the Labour Party were going to abolish the non-dom regime. The Conservative Party had until very recently stayed quiet on it. We now find the Chancellor says he's been thinking about abolishing the non-dom regime for years. And now we found out that he is abolishing it from April 2025. It's not an abolition and nothing to replace it. We'll end up with a residence-based system instead that will allow people to claim a tax exemption for their overseas income and gains for up to 4 years, provided when they first come to the UK they weren't tax resident here for the 10 years leading up to their arrival. This regime, so limiting of the non-dom regime to this new residence-based system, is expected to raise about £2.7 billion a year by the time we get to 28, 29. So it's collecting a fair amount of tax. Non-doms are already thought to be paying about £8.5 billion a year in tax. So if many of those people leave the UK because they don't like the look of the new regime, they may find that actually this doesn't raise very much money at all. I suspect very few people will actually leave, but we may see fewer people coming to make the UK their home for longer periods of time. But the purpose of choosing 4 years is it still allows people to come on a normal working secondment to the UK, possibly to work in the financial sector in London and still keep their overseas income out of the UK tax charge. The inheritance tax rules, also linked to the domicile rules, are up in the air a little bit at the moment. There's no firm position taken in the announcement in the budget. The suggestion in the papers is that there may be a 10-year run-in period, so until you've been resident here for 10 years, you won't be subject to UK inheritance tax on your worldwide assets. It will only be your UK assets that will be within the regime. This is incredibly important because lots of people who come to the UK, say from the US, or from India, will either be coming from jurisdictions with no inheritance tax or with inheritance tax limits that are very high compared to our exemptions. So I think that needs proper thought, but a change to the non-dom regime was inevitable. This isn't a terrible outcome for non-doms as they still get some relief. There are some fairly generous transitional rules which will allow existing non-doms to remit money to the UK over the next 2 tax years, starting from the abolition of the rules. So from April 2025 onwards for the 2 years, they can remit to the UK paying just 12% tax on their remittances, whereas before they may have been facing up to 45% tax. So a real softening of the blow there, and if this survives a change of government as well, we'll have a new regime for overseas nationals coming to live and work in the UK. Good news and bad news for landlords. We've got a reduction in the capital gains tax rate. So we always had an enhanced capital gains tax rate for residential property. Currently it's 28%, whereas the main rate of capital gains tax is just 20%. The Chancellor's decided that in order to actually collect more tax, he needs more liquidity in the property market, and reducing the capital gains tax rate would introduce more liquidity and therefore more tax is collected. So the 28% rate will come down to 24% from the 6th of April 2024. That does mean if you're selling your property between now and the 6th of April 2024, you may want to think about delaying that sale to benefit from the lower rate rather than the higher rate. And in the government's own numbers, they expect about 250 million of gains to be delayed until next tax year. The 18% rate, which is the basic rate of capital gains tax on residential property, remains that's unchanged. And don't forget, we also see a reduction in the capital gains tax annual exemption to £3,000 from the coming tax year. So if you are thinking about delaying the sale of your property, you need to crunch all the numbers and see if, when you put everything into the calculator, whether you're better or worse off with the annual exemption reducing as well. The bad news is if you were relying on the furnished holiday let regime, which was a regime that applied to certain properties that were let out to lots of different people for not very much time at all each period of letting, then you benefited from all sorts of wonderful tax regimes. You could benefit from business asset disposal relief, which meant you paid only 10% capital gains tax rather than 28% capital gains tax. You could claim capital allowances, and importantly, you could claim full relief for your mortgage interest. Now, that regime is being blamed for pricing people out of the property market where you live by the seaside. If you want to buy a place in Cornwall, you can't because lots of people have bought those properties to let them out. So the abolition of this regime from April 2025 is intended to mean those properties then end up back on the market because you'll, one, not be able to deduct all your mortgage interest anymore, or you'll not get full tax relief for the deduction of your mortgage interest. And if you sell before April 2025, there's a good chance you'll only pay 10% capital gains tax, whereas afterwards you'll pay the new 24% rate. It's not just properties by the seaside that qualify for furnished holiday let rules. Actually, a lot of properties let on Airbnb, which are going to be short lets, let to lots of different people for short periods of time. You may find that a flat in London let on Airbnb qualifies as a furnished holiday let. So I think the government are really looking to stamp it out because they perceive it to be a regime that's being abused.